Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Syria after Assad, what next for the country and region? On December 8, 2024, over 50 years of Assad family rule in Syria came to an end. Rebel forces led by the Islamic group HTS took over the country, and President Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia. So, what lies ahead for Syria and the region in a post-Assad era? With a history of links to al-Qaeda, can HTS be trusted to bring about inclusive, democratic governance? What role might Syria's neighbors play in its transition, and in regional and wider security? How quickly could post-conflict reconstruction aid Syria's recovery, and which avenues are available to hold both individual and state actors accountable for crimes against the Syrian people? To discuss these and related issues, tune into our live debate, bringing your questions and comments for the panel.
Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next 90 minutes on this Democracy Forum debate, where we drill down deeply on global issues of the day, often coming up with conclusions far apart from mainstream commentary and media. Syria, for so long that rock of a stable yet brutal dictatorship, ruined by civil war that erupted in the slipstream of the Arab Spring, mixed with America's slightly flawed vision of imposing its system of democratic government on cultures and traditions far removed from its own. And now with a new leader who emerged from al-Qaeda, the very enemy that attacked America on 9/11, and after what seemed like a honeymoon lull, horrendous ethnic killing over the past few days. Syria after Assad, what next for the country and region? To answer that, we have a superb panel of experts. Aaron David Miller, Munqeth Othman Agha, Federica D'Alessandra, and Karen Sudkamp. But as always, I ask the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, which will explore the political landscape following the fall of Bashar al-Assad in early December last year, and the emergence of a new regime spearheaded by the Hayat al-Sham HTS militia, led by the self-appointed president, Ahmed Al-Sharah. I am grateful to the team at TDF for selecting this topic and for inviting a panel of experts to consider the future for Syria and the repercussions for the Middle East. I'm delighted that each of our panelists has accepted our invitation, and I keenly look forward to their contributions. And as always, my thanks to Humphrey Hawksley for accepting the role of moderator. The emergence of HTS from the Syria branch of al-Qaeda as a leading force in Syria's transition has raised critical questions about governance, international recognition, and the prospect of an inclusive and peaceful Syria, or whether the nation risks descending into further fragmentation. As the former head of MI6, John Sawyers, notes, I quote, HTS is still rooted in a brand of Salafist Islamism that is unpopular even within the majority Sunni community. And he adds, Syria is on a path to fragmentation that would be a lost opportunity and a gift to terrorist groups such as ISIS and al-Qaeda. However, at a conference convened by HTS in Damascus in February, Ahmed Al-Sharah promised to unite a divided country and to steer Syria towards an inclusive future, explaining he intends to form a transitional justice body, I quote, to heal the wounds and wash away pains after decades of dictatorship. And in addition, he declared his intention to draft a national constitution and to ban armed groups from operating outside a new state structure, claiming, I quote, the unity of arms and their monopoly by the state is not a luxury, but a duty and an obligation. But it is unclear how Syria can follow a path to democratic and inclusive political systems. Over the last 10 days, a sudden surge in violence in the northeast has claimed the lives of nearly 1,000 civilians and raised the spectre of a return to civil war. Clearly, the carnage in the Alawite areas is indicative of Syria's fragmentation. The Kurds have their own enclaves in the north, while the Druze and other militias in the south continue to maintain a sphere of influence. Israel backs Druze, Turkey backs the Sunni Arab groups, and the United States backs the Kurds, while Russia still hopes to regain its influence. I quote, outside powers are involved partly for the legitimate purpose of protecting their borders from chaos, and partly because they spy a chance to control Syria's future, writes The Economist. Although HTS is now the backbone of the new government in Damascus, most of northern Syria is still under the control of the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, the SNA, while the SDF, the armed forces of the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, oversee 95% of Syria's oil and gas reserves. But al-Sharah's government's shortcomings also reflect the weakness of Syria's state, the results of 14 years of a brutal and relentless civil war, which has shrunk the economy by 85%, where exports have slumped from $18 billion in 2011 to less than $1.8 billion in 2021, and where the value of the currency has plummeted from 50 lira to the United States dollar to almost 11,000. Syria is an impoverished society where the price of bread has risen eightfold since December, and where more than 90% of Syrians live below the poverty line. Clearly, the country requires a vast amount of foreign investment to pay for reconstruction. Perhaps a third of homes, roughly half of all schools and hospitals, have been destroyed or damaged. But equally pressing is the need to ameliorate the current sanctions regime, which will have to be lifted to avoid economic collapse and the very real risk of Syria becoming a failed state and spreading mayhem to its neighbors. As a seasoned Middle East commentator concludes, I quote, "Many Syrians want Ahmed Al-Sharah to succeed because the alternative is too bleak to ponder." Well, welcome to the webinar this afternoon, and please pass your comments or questions to the panel through the chair.
Lord Charles Bruce, thank you very much for that. Further fragmentation, a gift to terrorist groups, and massive reconstruction, even to get it back on its feet again. Our first panelist is Aaron David Miller from the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As a negotiator and analyst, he has been intricately involved in America's attempts to bring peace to the Middle East and has written extensively on the challenge, calling one of his earlier books, The Much Too Promised Land, America's elusive search for Arab-Israeli peace. Syria after Assad, what next for the country and the region? Aaron David Miller, give us the view from Washington.
Humphrey, thank you so much. Lord Charles Bruce, thanks for including me, and it's an honor to be here with such a distinguished panel. I think I approached today's subject, and I'll try to be brief. I want to make a half a dozen observations, but I do so with a profound sense of humility and sober assessment of what we don't know. I'm intrigued very much and usually divide my analysis into what I would call the headlines and the trend lines. We need to keep an eye on both, but I think the core question that we need to address, and that's my first observation, is this: will Syria prove to be the exception to the rule that has been created over the past several decades? There is no precedent, unless I'm missing something, for the removal of an Arab authoritarian that didn't lead either to more repression or some level of state dysfunction, if not state failure. Egypt after Mubarak, more repression. Yemen after Abdel Salah, a divided polity. Tunisia, a hopeful case for democratization after Ben Ali, more authoritarianism. And of course, Libya after Gaddafi, a divided polity. So I ask myself the question, and I cannot answer it. It will hang over this panel. It'll hang in the months and years to come, as to whether or not Syria can be an exception. I don't want to prejudge that question. I would only suggest humbly, in 3 or 4 other observations that the lift to make Syria the exception is going to be indeed a very heavy one. My second observation deals with the internal dynamic. And here I think the challengers are really quite galactic. If there was a honeymoon in the transition from the Assads to HTS and what is now a transitional government under the presidency of Ahmed Al-Sharah, I think that honeymoon ended in the first week of March with an upsurge instigated in large part by a very well-organized core of pro-Assad loyalists, former military commanders and other middle-level figures of the regime, many drawn in the military from Syria's 4th Division, which was heavily influenced by the Iranians. Attack on Shara's security forces, which then, of course, led to what Ahmed Al-Sharah hoped he could avoid and what he articulated in the beginning in January and February, but no revenge policy. That, unfortunately, largely because of the absence of command and control, most of the killing was not done by organized HTS elements. It was likely done by foreign fighters, by civilians, and others. Also, I might add, by the Syrian National Army elements, which is proving to be, it's in some cases, a very disruptive force. So I guess Shar has created a committee. This is going to be some sort of test, I think, of Shar's credibility. Will there be any accountability? Accounting first to what actually happened, and then any accountability. It's going to be a test as to whether or not the government has that capacity to function. I'd also point out that there are suspicions among Syrian minority groups that HTS, even in its most organized fashion, has not produced the kind of transparency and inclusion that many hoped would result. This is obviously still a work in progress, but it's going to be an extremely heavy lift, partly because the government, the central government, as Lord Charles Bruce alluded to, does not control the country. Forget for a moment external actors that are now playing on the Syrian stage. You have Druze militias in Suwaida, you have Kurds in the northeast, you've got the Islamic State in central Syria. Integration into an organized military command is going to be extremely difficult. Which brings me to my third observation, and that is the issue of external challenges. They are, I think, by any standard, extraordinarily complicated. The main players in Syria, Iran and Russia, are clearly receding, although their influence is not to be ruled out entirely. The Turks obviously now occupy a much more central position. They were the main backer of Hayat or al-Sham in what I suspect not even the Turks believed in those fateful days of December. You might even describe this as an accidental coup. I'm not sure the Turks, let alone HTS, believed that the regime was as hollowed out as it was and it would crumble as quickly as it did. Turkey's interest in Syria can be summarized, I think, in 3 words: territory, in the sense of a buffer zone in the north; refugees, both those in Turkey proper, and Kurds. The Turks also hope to benefit, I suspect, with the Qataris from whatever reconstruction projects that will occur once and if sanctions are ultimately lifted. The Israelis, I suspect, were as surprised as any party by what happened. They, in addition, just to show you how entrenched the notion of Assad's continuity was, the Israelis participated with Saudi and other Gulf efforts in the waning days of the Assad regime in an effort to reach a deal with Assad. In the Israeli case, it was break your relationship with Iran, and we will find a way to improve your stock in Washington and get sanctions lifted. None of that, of course, worked. But it does show and validate to some degree that the devil you know may well be more certain and more to your interest than the devil you don't. The Israelis, of course, have acted most probably in the wake of the long shadow of October 7 to increase their security along that border, not just by supplementing the UNDOF in the disengagement zone, which has lasted over 50 years, but also to hold territory, a considerable amount of it, in Syria proper. They've also decimated former Syrian military stocks and are perpetually concerned about the possibility of any chemical weapons stocks. They have created a situation, and they are in this regard coincident with Ahmed Al-Sharah in minimizing the influence of both Iran and Hezbollah. The Gulf, I think by and large, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and clearly the Egyptians are wary about Shara. They all three under authoritarian leadership, Mubarak in particular, and now al-Sisi, wary about the jihadi roots of Shara. And I think they will pursue a sort of trust but verify policy as Shara seeks to define the character of what kind of government is going to emerge. It is striking, though, that Shara's first foreign visit outside of Syria was to Saudi Arabia for any number of reasons I think you could gather. The Qataris are more sympathetic, obviously, given their pronounced support for Islamic groups. And they're going to want to work, or the Turks will want to work with the Qataris in terms of financing reconstruction efforts. The fourth issue, the U.S. role, it's very hard to divine. On one hand, CENTCOM played a key role, the press reporting, in terms of brokering the agreement between the SDF and Shara, which hopefully will pave the way for a greater integration of the SDF and the Kurds into an integrated Syrian state. But at the same time, there's serious talk of withdrawing the 2,000 American forces deployed in 7 or 8 bases within the country. Those forces are there for any number of reasons. I would argue it's still in the American national interest to keep them there, but it's unclear. We have a president whose conception of the national interest is subordinated to any number of other factors: his financial interests, his politics, his vanities, his pet peeves and grievances. And it's really no telling. Donald Trump has taken very little interest in Syria. He considers it, I think, among many of the lands in this region, to be a collection of an unhappy place, a kind of marriage of blood and sand. So it's really unclear to me, frankly, where American policy is headed. And that's, frankly, a shame. The removal of sanctions, particularly the secondary sanctions imposed by the Caesar Act of 2020, are critically important to Syria's recovery. I see no indication beyond the humanitarian waiver that the Department of State has granted that we're on the verge of either delisting HTS as a terrorist organization or removing, and again, there are sanctions imposed by executive order, which could be removed. Congressional sanctions will have to be removed by Congress. And that is, as I mentioned, I think very sad, because the urgency of economic recovery, the desperation of so many Syrians is acute. Fifth, and then I'll conclude, the bar is very low, which I think is a positive feature. After the Assads, what could be worse? 500,000 or more Syrians murdered and killed, 7 million Syrians displaced outside of the country, in addition to millions more internally displaced, and a country bled dry. So in a way, it's a paradox, I suppose. The bar is so low that progress, any progress to begin to stabilize Syria and point it in a different direction would be welcome. Finally, the future. I'd like to consult my good friend, who I often refer to, the famed oracle at Delphi, Pythia. But even reading the best golden trails and coffee grinds, I don't think Pythia could really chart for you a course of where Syria is headed. Is it headed for a centralized, unified future under the rule perhaps of a Erdogan-like traditional Islamic leader? Is it going to be decentralized in a positive way, a sort of federal structure, a better version of Iraq? Or are we talking about disintegration and fragmentation of the country into rival militias and ethnic and sectarian communities? We don't know. Again, I wish the Syrians well, hoping for the best. My experience, however, tells me in this conflict-ridden region, it's going to be extremely difficult for the Syrians to be what I hope they would be, is that Arab state exception.
Aaron, David Miller, thank you very much for that. Before I let you go, you've had long decades of experience in the Middle East and dealing and negotiating behind the scenes as well as in front. And you talked about exceptional. Could it be an exceptional case? Has anything changed over the decades in the way that the Syrians or the Arab mindset, whatever you want to call it, leaving out the Israel-Palestine thing, has anything changed in the view to the West and the view they run the countries and that whole thing? Can you give us an idea?
I mean, look, I think for years, the Americans in the West dealt with what I call the Arab authoritarians. And they came in two versions. There were at least for US policy, there were the adversarial authoritarians, those who challenged American policy directly, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, to some degree, Hafez al-Assad. Then there were the acquiescent authoritarians, the ones we did business with. Those are the Ben Alis, the Mubaraks, the Abdul Salah, the King Husseins, the King Abdullahs. The Arab Spring came along. The hope was that there would be a third way. There wasn't. As I mentioned, the Arab world broke down where the Arab Spring appeared, with one obvious exception, the Gulf, which remained preternaturally stable during this period. But again, regimes led by authoritarians, rentier states to some degree. So you now are dealing with at least 5 Arab states in active phases of dysfunction: Libya, Yemen, Syria. I'll put Iraq in that category, Yemen. And the American view, I think, ending with the 2 longest wars in American history, was any sense on the American side that you would transform this region, I think, was simply ground up in the bitter realities of 20 years of efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'd only close with 2 points. Number one, the American interest, the interest of this president, not surprisingly, is drawn to the Gulf. That's money, that's hydrocarbons, that's the Abraham Accords, that's flattery by kings, emirs. I mean, one American president took their first trip to Saudi Arabia. None. Donald Trump did in his first term. Yeah. One last point. If you ask me, in this region, who are the 3 most functional states, the ones that are able to protect their powers beyond their borders? It would be the 3 non-Arabs: Iran, Turkey, and Israel. All have tremendous economic potential, all have competent militaries and intelligence organizations. As I mentioned before, all have a capacity, for good or ill, to project their power beyond their borders.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. There's so many questions raised that we'll come back to about, but basically, in short, there, an acquiescent authoritarian state can get a tick from Washington, as we've seen. But how is that going to emerge if it does? Our next panelist is Munqeth Othman Agha from the Middle East Institute, also in Washington, D.C. His research focuses primarily on Syria. He's written extensively on the challenges that look at political violence, post-conflict reconstruction, long-term development, all those elements needed to piece a country back together again. Munqeth Othman Agha, can it be done with Syria? Tell us what you know.
Thank you. Good evening, good morning. Thank you, Humphrey and Lord Charles, for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. I will focus here, as you said, more on the probably local dynamics. I will talk more on the issues of reconstructions, recovery, and public sector reforms. I would just echo a few points that Aaron has said already, that what happened in Syria is tremendous, is very large, and was unthinkable. I would say 4 months ago, nobody expected this to happen. And also, I think nobody was prepared for it. Nobody had a plan. I think including also the guys who toppled Assad himself. I think they didn't have a full plan how to rule the country after that. This is why we see this a very difficult, and we would see this very difficult and challenging transition. The things on the ground. I was in Syria in January, and I would say everybody think of the transition in 2 words. They are hopeful, they are happy, but they always put this but. They are hopeful. The stake is high. Everybody is ambitious of what might happen. As Aaron said, what would be worse than Assad? And people say, if we get rid of Assad, and that was the biggest nightmare for the majority of Syrians after the displacement of almost half of the population, the destruction of the country, the destruction of the sector, of the economy as well, most of the economic sectors. So I think people are ambitious and happy, but also they are very worried. The challenges are very high, and internal and externally. I would start with the first point, with the construction. And before I talk about the construction, I think is very useful to look also to the patterns of destruction in order to understand that. Most of the major urban centers in Syria are heavily destroyed. I would think of only 2 or 3 to 4 major cities that are not heavily destroyed, but the majority are destroyed. We talk in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs and Hama. They suffered a major destruction throughout the conflict. The destruction is massive, but also is spatially distributed in a certain way. It's concentrated in informal, dense, and low-income areas. So the poorest portion of the population were the heaviest to be impacted by the conflict. And that put another obstacle for reconstructing these areas, because these are not only harder to reconstruct, but also putting us in front of this dilemma whether to upgrade these areas or to reproduce the same obstacles or the same challenges that were before. These areas also suffer high challenges in terms of ownership, because these ownership are not formal, and the majority of their population have been displaced. So we have a lot of challenges in terms of reconstructing these areas, in terms of ownership, in terms of the return of the population. But of course, the most challenge, or the biggest challenge, the sanctions, also the financial flow to the country. Because sanctions not only deter the foreign aid to come to the country and the biggest investment, but also the Syrian businessmen and to the local companies to come to the country and to invest in these sectors. Also, it puts challenges and restrictions on importing materials and equipment to initiate large investment. As a strategy for reconstruction, I would say we can work on both trajectories. One, we can think of also of a large scale project, but also we can give some space for the community-led reconstruction plans, that we can provide the space for the neighborhood or little towns to form cooperative between each others and to start working, because they are more able to focus on these challenges that I mentioned before, such as the ownership, the displacement, and they are more aware of the sensitive issues that facing them. I would say in terms of the public sector reform, what we've been so far, that the government, which was the HTS before, that ruled Idlib for a couple of years, they were busy in three main priorities, I think. In my opinion, the first one is the economy. They were very worried about giving some boost to the local economy. Secondly is the military and security, and third one is the international legitimacy. And each one of them, they did some progress, but still I think there's a lot to be done in that. They took some steps as well in terms of reforming the public sector. I think that happened into two main steps. The first one is to sack what we say the shadow employees. The Assad regime before, they employed a lot, I would say hundreds of thousands of employees that they were called shadow employees or ghost employees. They were employed according to, based on clientist or nepotism, and they actually did the work, and they were a heavy load on the public budget. So the first thing that the government did is to sack or to fire these employees, to give them 3 months of paid leave before they find another job. And this caused instability into two ways. First of all, we have hundreds of thousands of people who lost their income, even though it was a little income, but still was being able to give them this opportunity to survive economically. And this will probably cause a major instability in the future if these large number of population they lost their income. So the government was I think betting on in attracting some investment from abroad in order to produce different livelihood opportunities for these employees. However, the sanctions and the restrictions on the foreign aid coming to the country, establishing new businesses, and also providing a higher budget for the state, I think that was a biggest challenge for the state in order to do that. The second point is the sectarian aspect of that, because we don't deny the fact that employment during Assad regime took some sectarian shapes or sectarian aspect. While reforming this or reversing these policies might also be perceived from a sectarian perspective. And a vast majority of these employees are concentrated in the coast, in Hama and Homs and Damascus as well. And that might be a source of instability in the future. That might take also a sectarian element. What happened in the coast a few weeks ago, I don't think that is related directly to that. I think this is a different dynamic related to the military and security that I will talk about in a minute. But I think also what happened in the coast, we might see a few waves also of instability and insecurity based on that. That also connected to the second point, which is reforming the security and army sector. I think the only sector that the new government or transitional government was, I think, very insisting on reforming or re-establishing from the ground is the army and the security. They dissolved the army, the Assad army, and the security forces. That means also putting another hundred of thousands of young men, many of whom kept their weapons out of service. And this is also probably led to few instabilities. One of we saw already in the coast. What the second thing also is the international recognition. I think the transitional government was busy in terms of seeking international recognition for their new government. There was supposed to be a new government announced early March, but I think it wasn't. It's not announced so far. I think that's largely due probably to the insecurity that happened earlier, also to the probably one of also probably also to their ability to outreach the communities. They also had some attempts in order to preserve the territorial integrity. As Aaron said, we have in the northeast, for example, the Kurds ruling them. And we had a good deal that happened between the transitional government and SDF last few weeks ago. With the Sweda, we have a different, also a kind of autonomous region in the coast. It's not, there is areas that were out of the control of the government. All of these are challenges for the new government. I think they were essential in postponing the announcement of the new government. One of the reasons as well is the foreign sanctions. I can't emphasize enough how the foreign sanctions are deterring now that the international and local interaction with the government. One of the figures that was invited to join the government, he refused the invitation to join the government, and the explanations for many around him said because fearing of dealing with the government that is still classified or led by an organization that's still classified as a terrorist group. That's also put a lot of pressure on the individuals, figures inside the country, on businessmen, in terms of collaborating and work with the government. So in conclusion, I don't want to take a lot of time. In conclusion, I think the recovery of the country and reconstruction has both challenges internally and externally. From internally, I think the territorial fragmentation, the stability, also the transitional justice is a very important element in terms of healing the wounds inside the country, and allow the different communities along previous military controlling lines in order to cooperate between each others. And this is important in terms also of unifying the services that was previously fragmented in the country. Externally, I think the biggest challenge, as I said, is the sanctions and facilitating the flow of the investment and the return of the refugees to the country. I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was most illuminating, if not depressing. If Aaron is still here, I'd like to bring him in also with this follow-up question that I want to ask you Munqeth, as well. You mentioned the sanctions, you mentioned international recognition, you gave the list of the sort of benchmarks that were needed. At what stage will people start investing in reconstruction in Syria? We are not talking months, are we? We are not even talking years. What will people need to see? And if Aaron's still there, what would the US need to see to begin to actually say, yes, we can rebuild this country?
I think there are two factors. I think the first one is being technically able to invest in the country. That means we need to see some kind of reform for the government, in terms also for the humanitarian sector, for the actors that are able to receive and spend this money effectively. Also, we need to see some reform in terms of the economic sectors and the infrastructures. Without reforming the electricity, the roads, the fuel, even the companies, if they are able to invest in the country, they won't be able to do so. Externally, I think we need to see some serious lifting of sanctions, because without sanctions being left, there will be a difficulty in attracting investment, especially if we have sanctions for a limited period. If we have a sanctions relief for 6 months, I think this is a very short period for companies and for government to invest. I know that from the Western perspective, that they want to be an inclusive government. They want to be some serious reform before lifting the sanctions. But at the same time, if you don't lift the sanctions, you won't be able to see that. As I gave the example before. So there are.
I wanted to bring in to Aaron, if you're here, a question from Tracy Croggan that's here that actually alludes to what we're talking about. What does the panel foresee about the emerging escalating rivalry between American allies, Israel, Turkey, Syria? Aaron, you mentioned that in President Trump's response. Can you give us an idea, Aaron, of the same thing that we've just heard? What benchmarks are going to be needed until we can see that this society is going to be developed and rebuilt again?
I mean, I think that's part of the problem. The administration has a lot. I mean, the process of delisting HTS is actually quite simple. It could be done by the Secretary of State. and it probably should be done. The issue of sanctions is more complicated, and I don't think the administration, beyond reference to the Paris principles talking about an inclusive, transparent governing structure, has laid out what its conditions are. I think that's part of the frustration. You noticed in the Secretary of State's condemnation of the March 6 violence, he condemned the counterattack by foreign fighters and civilians on the Alawis, but failed to condemn the pro-Assad loyalists' initial strikes, which suggest a real bias or a blindness on the issue of the jihadis and the Islam bias against the Islamists and the jihadis. And I think that may well carry over. We don't have a special envoy to Syria that's been designated. My understanding is there's no direct contact on the ground in Damascus with the Shara government. All these things are required and needed. I just think it's not on the presidents or the national security advisors or the Secretary of State's radar screen. And when it is on, it's much more focused on what are they doing about chemical weapons, which is a legitimate concern, and
So
any connections to the Iranians.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking back to the decades that it took for Vietnam to come out of the out of international isolation over issues about missing in action and various things like that. Vietnam, which is now a strategic ally.
Right, but Humphrey, just keep in mind one thing. The President of the United States is in the process of normalizing his relationship with Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
If in fact he wants sanctions rule, the executive order sanctions or restoration of diplomatic relations, they were never broken, but basically to normalize relations with the Russians, he can do it. Governance about choosing.
Yes.
It's as simple as that, or not choosing. And the administration seems to me, 2 months in, maybe it's an unfair metric of time to judge, has made other choices.
And for both of you, very quickly, before we move on, if it's a scenario that seems to be emerging, that this is not going to happen overnight or anytime soon, what is the risk of other state actors or non-state actors, terrorist groups moving in there and building bases and taking bigger influence and control? Aaron, quickly, and then we.
I think the two primary suspects would be the ones that have lost influence, the Russians and the Iranians. I think the anger and animosity is so deep against what the Russians and the Iranians have done that it's going to be very hard to make an entree, but not impossible. Mm-hmm. Not impossible.
Yeah. Munqeth, what's your view on that?
I mean, the risk of not lifting sanctions on the country. I would just emphasize the point again that the rhetoric that the condition to lift sanctions to see more inclusive and democratic government involved. But if you don't lift sanctions, that won't happen anyway, because without the ability, the financial ability of the government, without its ability to reach out to international and local actors, they won't be able to do that. They won't be able to form inclusive. So the risk is that the country will fragment more and it will eventually collapse. We will have a failed state. And all the risk for having sanctions now will continue and will emphasize.
Okay, that is not a positive outcome, but we're going to now move on to our third panelist, where we're going to look at the sort of the question of accountability, of sort of political reconstruction, as it were. Federica D'Alessandra of the Institute of Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict at the University of Oxford, but also connected and with the Carnegie Endowment Center in Washington, D.C., where she is at the moment. She's looked at detail in how to hold people accountable, those who commit civil war atrocities. Would it be possible? Would it help or hinder the process in healing Syria? She knows about this from other countries. And in a recent paper, our panelists pointed out the need for genuine process in that thing and not acts of revenge and show trials. But how can that be done? Federica D'Alessandra, give us your argument.
Thank you, Humphrey, and to the Democracy Forum, Lord Bruce, for inviting me. So I guess I want to try and drive home three key elements of this discussion around accountability. And And of course, we can circle back to any of them and expand. The first one would be, why does accountability matter, right? This is a country that is emerging from civil war. There's so many priorities, pulling in different directions for its new authorities, very scarce resources, enormous challenges, as we've heard. Why accountability? What's the role of accountability in all of this? And should it even be a priority given everything that we're seeing? The second thing I want to try and highlight is that, which actually flows from the first point, which is actually when it comes to accountability, maybe this is one of the few areas where Syria comparatively already has a leg up, because if it's true that, when it comes to any other stakeholder that is currently involved in trying to shape and support the Syrian transition, everyone was unprepared. That's not the case for stakeholders in the accountability and justice ecospace. And finally, the third point that I want to drive home is, what do we actually mean by accountability, and what this can even look like in a context like Syria. So just to try and break this down in a little bit more detail, on the first point, why does accountability matter? So first and foremost, it has been a persistent demand of the civil society ever since the civil war started, at least. There's a lot that Syrian civil society groups disagree on, but they all have persistently been united in demanding justice for Assad-era crimes specifically. Leaving the use of chemical weapons aside, to which I'll return, hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been arbitrarily detained, subject to unfathomable brutality in detention, including widespread and systematic torture, often resulting in thousands of executions, thousands more having been forcibly disappeared, and 130,000 Syrians remain missing to this day, which has actually been another persistent demand of the civil society that dovetails with the accountability question, which is truth, finding about their fate, about their whereabouts, and especially the need to provide support and reparation to their families. And all these three components, reparations, truth, and justice/accountability, go hand in hand in any national reconciliation strategies and are, in fact, foundational pillars. This is something that Syria's new authorities and its new president understood early on, and that's why one of the very first few things that he proclaimed right after ousting Assad was his commitments to both serious missing persons, but also that the most responsible for torture and other regime atrocities would be held accountable. Delivering on that promise, it's not easy, and we can talk more about how the could happen, but the intention is there, and I think that that's an important signal because it does respond to a persistent demand from the civil society. I think it's also important that just looking outside of the Syrian context, we have decades of experience and data-driven scholarly work that persistently shows that in absolute impunity, particularly in sectarian conflicts like the civil war, can only seed future instability because they might disincentivize disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of former combatants, encourage retribution and vigilante justice, entrench grievances along sectarian lines, and thus drive new cycles of violence. And of course, many minorities already harbor deep fears about their future under Syria's new rulers, and we're seeing great violence incidents already erupting in, Latakia and other Alawite strongholds, which, if not stopped in their tracks, if state-affiliated forces aren't disciplined and all individuals involved aren't held to account, there's a real risk that this violence might seriously threaten Syria's security and its new authorities' attempt to stabilize the country. Importantly, however, I think that one of the reasons why accountability is so crucial in the context of Syria is that after decades of brutal rule under the Assad family, ending impunity can also mark a new chapter, if you like, in Syria's national unity and lay the foundation for a new social contract that is built precisely on the rejection of the violence and abuse that characterize government rule under Assad. Now, going to my second point, which is perhaps unlike other areas that are being touched upon in this conversation, when it comes to accountability for international crimes, Syria actually already does have a leg up, and that's because of the huge amount of groundwork that has already been laid, both by the Syrian civil society throughout the civil war, as well as by the international community. And I'll try and give you sort of a big picture sort of snapshot of what this landscape looks like. And as I mentioned, we can, of course, expand in the rest of the discussion. But to begin with, there's been a huge amount of documentation by the Syrian civil society actors themselves, both within Syria and in the diaspora. And this has been extremely important because it has allowed to build up a persistent, consistent, and huge record of the violence and the crimes that have been committed. And this documentation work, this archival work, can be leveraged in a number, for a number of transitional justice purposes, including accountability. But what's been so important about Syrian civil society's sort of frontline involvement in documentation practices has been that, obviously there are heroic efforts, but their agency and their advocacy has been instrumental in actually unlocking and sort of opening new pathways for international justice that until the fall of Assad in December of last year truly only appeared as the only viable options. Now that Assad has fallen, of course, there's additional avenues that have opened up insofar as potential avenues for accountability inside the country. But when it comes to accountability outside of the country, already over the last 14 years, there's been enormous movement and enormous developments. There's been a number of investigative bodies that have been established by the United Nations and other international organizations. I won't enter into detail in terms of all of their work, but there's been a commission of inquiry that was set up by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011 that has been, documenting scores and scores of incidents, horrific violence of all sorts, the use of barrel bombs and cluster munitions, attacks on humanitarian workers and convoys, attacks against children, use of starvation as a method of war, and so on and so forth, right? Like they've provided, I think they've provided more than 24 reports and conference papers to the Human Rights Council documenting all of this. And crucially, as the commissioner recently reported during the Human Rights Council session, after, in the last couple of months, actually, it has been the very first time since their establishment in 2011 that they were actually allowed to enter the country, and so that they could carry out this documentation and interview witnesses directly inside the country. There's been also investigations mandated by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. There's been various of them, but one in particular, which was set up by the UN Human Rights Council in 2015, if I remember correctly, to which Russia actually had to acquiesce because the alternative was retaliation by the US military in response to the Assad regime repeated use of chemical weapons. Was extremely important because it was actually tasked not only to document instances of incidents, but actually to attribute responsibility and to sort of gather evidence, not only of who did it, but how do we know that that's how they did it, who did it. I think another incredibly promising, and in fact, to me, this is the most promising development when it comes to accountability in the context of Syria has actually been the creation of almost new breed of accountability mandate, right? Like we conceptualize this often as pre-prosecutorial in the sense that this mechanism, which is called the Syria International Impartial Independent Mechanism, which is often abbreviated as IIIM, was created in 2016 by the General Assembly in response to Russia's vetoing of the extension, essentially, of the mandate of the OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism I was just mentioning. What they're essentially tasked to do, first of all, this is an incredibly well-resourced body. It's really a step up from a lot of the investigations that we've seen before. It's not necessarily exclusively focusing on sort of big picture documentation and sort of the crime base, but actually is perpetrator-focused investigations, meaning that they're very explicitly and deliberately looking for linkage evidence. So they identify perpetrators and they collect, preserve to appropriate chain of command and appropriate standards the evidence that links specific suspects to the crimes that they've documented that they attribute to the suspect, fundamentally what they do is they carry out criminal investigations, right? And this is entirely novel in the space of international justice because, we've had tribunals in the past, but we've never had pre-prosecutorial bodies. So what these pre-prosecutorial bodies, other than sort of carrying out these investigations and preparing sort of prosecution-ready case files, if you want, is they actually feed them to various jurisdictions. So we've seen, this mechanism has received over 350 requests for assistance by a number of jurisdictions that are investigating and carried out proceedings in accordance with universal jurisdiction. And, we've seen convictions, for example. We've seen landmark convictions in German courts for, against former regime officials for crimes against humanity. We've seen indictments unsealed in the United States, for example, under the War Crimes Act. We've also seen 13 former officials indicted with arrest warrants pending in some of these cases in French courts, for example, including one for former President Bashar al-Assad himself, which at one point was challenged on the ground that, well, if he's president, can French courts exercise jurisdiction? But the point now is moot because he's no longer president. So this warrant is there and it remains, it remains standing. What these mechanism and other investigations of this nature have also done is they've fostered and supported other avenues for judicial accountability other than sort of universal jurisdiction proceedings. For example, we've seen a number of interstate proceedings brought against Syria at the International Court of Justice. One of the most prominent examples is certainly the case that the Netherlands and Canada initiated, I think in 2023, I want to say, on the basis of breaches of the Convention Against Torture, to which Syria is a party. But, Syria is also a party to a number of other conventions that could also offer additional avenues to hold the state responsible for these violations. And that's important because once you have judgments against the state, findings against the state, you can leverage those judgments and those findings to then sort of lay the legal foundations to leverage, already frozen assets and put those to, good use in supporting victims and help support the country's reconstruction. Examples of this might be, other than the Convention Against Torture, we have the Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We also have, a number of the crimes or the underlying acts that would qualify. Also touch on other conventions like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Those are the enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, etc. Finally, there's also a number of avenues for, international criminal proceedings. We can talk about whether the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is a pathway or not. I don't think it is, but if of interest, I can explain why in the Q&A. I think that the most promising, and in fact, the pathway that seems to resonate the most with the Syrian civil society groups that have been advocating for accountability, both inside and outside of Syria, would be some sort of domestic justice system, which can follow sort of a hybrid model, if you like, in the sense that it would be embedded within Syrian domestic courts. Obviously, that requires very significant legislative and institutional reform. But if we do get there, it could happen. It would have to obviously be subject to oversight and the sort of advice of international judges, prosecutors, and counsel. But, there is precedent in terms of where this has worked well, as well as where this has worked very badly. And I think that incorporating those lessons learned into how we develop current strategies for accountability for serious international crimes is extremely crucial. We don't know what will work, but we certainly know what will not work. And I think that that's an important point to underscore as part of the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Just very quickly, what is the point of this when it comes to reconstructing Syria in the way that we've just described? Is it for get personal justice, or will it heal the country?
I mean, there's a number of rationales for doing it, right? I think that when it comes to accountability in particular, there's a tendency to sort of hyperfixate on judicial accountability, criminal accountability, and that can be very important. And it is especially important for sort of higher level and
I think my question really is to try to nail it down. Is could it be damaging whilst the country is trying to heal? Could it be damaging to pick out people, like you said in your own warning, that they become revenge and show trials? And really to rebuild it, get the schools working, get everything else working, and then possibly see how to reconcile the past.
So let me put it this way, Humphrey. I think that on the basis of the body of knowledge that we already have and has been accumulated in countless examples, the risks of impunity, so no accountability whatsoever, far outweigh the risks of accountability, which obviously needs to happen within specific constraints and within specific parameters for it to actually be helpful in healing the country and supporting reconstruction. But we already know that impunity is going to be detrimental in the long term. So I think the conversation needs to be narrowed down in terms of, okay, what are the conditions and the steps that we need to be take today and in the long term to ensure that accountability is set on a course that is actually not detrimental, but in fact helpful to the future trajectory of the country.
That's really useful. Thank you so much for that. And we're going to return to some of those points you raised when we go to more general discussion. Our final panelist, we are going to examine Syria through a security lens with Karen Sudkamp from the RAND Corporation, where her brief includes terrorism, security, immigration, supply chains, all the areas that are impacted by violence in faraway places. Her earlier job was with the Defense Intelligence Agency as an analyst for the Middle East and on counterterrorism issues. Therefore, the perfect expertise to explain the dangers or the advantages of the new Syria. What should we look for and what should we do? Karen Sudkamp, share with us your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Humphrey, and everyone for joining today, and my fellow colleagues. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm probably going to lean a little bit more heavily on the concerns that I'm seeing, and many and the other panelists also brought these up today as well. We've talked a lot about the continuing instability and weakness in Syria. We hope that there's the potential for regrowth or for reconstruction and stability, but it's going to be a long road. There's internal and external challenges that the regime, that the al-Shara administration faces. So I'm going to talk about three different kind of categories of security concerns for the interim government. But also these are things that regional partners and the international community should really be thinking about as well, to help rebuild long-term security and stability in Syria. I don't think it will surprise you. I'll highlight a couple of internal concerns, external concerns, but then also highlight to human security concerns. While I'll talk about these kind of in their own separate bucket, they don't exist in a vacuum. And to be honest, they often intersect with each other. And along with that, the opportunity to improve or degrade Syria's stability. Thinking about the internal situation, is, whether the HTS-led interim government can deliver on its promises of national cohesion, security, and a better life than most Syrians have lived under for the past 14 years, and quite honestly, longer than that. There's a lot of discussion about the diversity of the Syrian population and how former President Bashar al-Assad played into these divisions to keep a population fractured so he could remain in power for as long as possible. But for the country to move forward, trust does need to be built between communities, but also between the Syrian population and HTS. As Francesca was talking about, that accountability process is going to be really important. But also kind of the elephant in the room that we've sort of touched on a little bit, but not too much, is, HTS's roots in, coming from al-Qaeda and, affiliations with the Islamic State before it became the Islamic State, and the concerns of the population about what that means for governance and truly what HTS's vision is for Syria. So thinking about that, in addition to the fact that we also need to really wonder, and I particularly wonder, is whether HTS can control the use of force within Syria. In the Northwest, we've already talked a little bit about the fighting that was seen earlier in the month by former regime forces, the government response, and then the killing of Alawite civilians throughout the countryside. This is a huge issue of being able to build trust, accountability, kind of all of those big issues for moving forward for a united Syria. Also, what was incredibly disconcerting to me in this was the use of mis and disinformation, or the amount of mis and disinformation that was going around about who was responsible for the first attacks, who made up former regime elements, but then also government forces and non-government fighters who came, who was responsible for targeted killings, all of those different things. So this is an area where other Syrian minorities are clearly taking note about the intentions and the capabilities of the interim government. In the Southwest, which was the heart of the revolution, there are groups in Dara and Soweto that have yet to join the interim government, and the current Syrian military. Also in the South, there's the additional issue of Israeli military actions that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but this further kind of degrades international stability and the trust that Southern Syrians could potentially place in the interim government moving forward. In the Northeast, we have this very evolving situation. Last week, al-Shara and the Syrian Syrian Democratic Forces Commander Mazloum Abdi agreed that the SDF would integrate into the Syrian government institutions, including the military. The details are sparse, but in the long run, this will help integrate the Syrian Kurdish population into Syria, but also that military force as well. The Syrian Kurds, for years at this point, have been under constant pressure from Turkish-backed Syrian militias and also Turkish forces themselves at times. So in a continuing dynamic, these kind of internal and external forces have also impeded, the SDF's ability to constantly focus on the Islamic State remnants that remain in northeast and eastern Syria. The Islamic State has been keeping the pressure up on the SDF since its territorial defeat in 2019. We talked before, the United States has been the primary supporter of the SDF, but there are a lot of questions about how the new administration is thinking about continuing support for the SDF, but also how it will continue to support the counter-ISIS fight in the long run. Also, a fun little tidbit here, it's potentially likely that al-Shara and STS would relish the chance to fight ISIS again. And there was a lot of conflict between the two groups before HTS was in Idlib, but even in Idlib as well. So after considering these internal challenges, I would hope that Syrians' neighbors would really want to be there to support rebuilding security. However, the two strongest militarily and economically, et cetera, neighbors appear to be more interested in maintaining their leverage over Damascus. And so the interim leaders must prove that they're up for the responsibility of protecting its borders, and have the ability to enforce, Syria's international legitimacy as well. We briefly already discussed Turkey, generally thought to be having more influence and increased influence in Syria since the fall of Assad. However, kind of the sticking point in this is U.S. support for the SDF. Ankara views this as a threat to Turkey and has consistently interfered or had one of the Syrian militias it backs to ensure that the Syrian Kurds do not gain too much economic, political, or security stability in the northeast. Attacks against Syrian Kurdish cities along the shared northern border, or even just kind of the threat of a Turkish incursion into Syria has pulled SDF attention away from governing and also fighting ISIS remnants. But on the other side, Turkey has recently set its own ceasefire deal with the PKK, which does have connections to the SDF. So along with the SDF Damascus deal, perhaps Turkish destabilization could have an opportunity to decrease as well. There was also a brief kind of discussion earlier about Israel. Under the Assad regime, Israel has exhibited some discernment about the military attacks that were launched into Syrian territory, focused on Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah targets. Since December, that has not been matched. Tel Aviv is arguing that Israeli security must be maintained, going after chemical weapons, but also key conventional military infrastructure. And Israeli forces have moved into the strategically important Golan Heights. Al-Shara has stated that the interim government doesn't pose any risk to or threats to Israel, but in this current environment, that is obviously not reassuring enough to Tel Aviv to not take matters into their own hands. So in the long run, this is a test of al-Shara's ability and responsibility to enforce and maintain territorial integrity. And as I mentioned earlier, an opportunity to build trust with Syrians in the southern provinces, that he does prioritize all of Syria in security, in maintaining security. And then just very briefly, I'd like to hit upon to what I term like human systems that have the ability to exacerbate instability and then also erode trust in the interim government. First is the question on the settlement of refugees and internally displaced persons. As has been discussed before, Syrians do need to return to the country just to support stabilization and reconstruction of both society and economy. But there also needs to be strategic discussions and planning about how people return, where they return to, in order to support that stability. There's also kind of this larger question about how the interim government will support or what to do with ISIS-affiliated families remaining in camps such as Al-Hol and ISIS-affiliated fighters being held in prisons by the SDF. And then finally, the interim government also really needs to be looking and thinking about like the scarcity of water and the impacts it will have on agriculture. Assad, ISIS, and Turkey have all used water to control and pressure Syrian civilians over the years. And as the country continues to become hotter, more arid and drier, this will impact where people can live, their livelihoods, and the ability to even grow food domestically in areas where agriculture had historically been located within the country. So with that, there's a lot of challenges that the interim government and al-Shara face to build trust domestically, to prove legitimacy regionally and internationally that that they have long-term Syrian interests in mind. Al-Shara does say he's dedicated to a united and diverse Syria, but only time will tell if that does provide a foundation for stability and security. And with that, back to you, Humphrey.
Karen, thank you very much. We have a question actually, and which you alluded to from Dr. Kumar. Is it realistic to expect the safe return home of Syrian refugees, especially minorities, despite the promises by al-Shara? Is it realistic? I mean, we've had a lot of talks about accountability, about political reconstruction. This is a grassroots, immediate one. Yeah. Is it realistic?
I would like to be optimistic and hopeful. However, my nature at this point is not fully optimistic. I think it is incredibly difficult. And if you look internationally, refugees don't normally return, or if they do, it's after decades of being displaced from their homes, where they have then set up lives and moved on in new communities. So I think it's an incredible challenge that faces not only the al-Shara administration, but also particularly neighboring countries like Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, who would like Syrian refugees to return to Syria because it causes various forms of instability within their own countries. So it probably would not be a orderly return going forward.
I mean, what we've got so far from this fascinating discussion is a raft of challenges, ranging from the very grassroots of the ethnic killings, the return of refugees, going right up to building the institutions that would be needed to make a secure Syria. I have another question that I'm going to give you, and then I'm going to open up to the panel. Amit Rana says, and I'm asking you, Karen, because of your sort of wider experience on this, would it be useful to compare HTS with the Taliban as a way of gauging how they might behave?
I mean, I think that is absolutely a concern and a fear of, I would posit, probably ordinary Syrians, but also the international community as well. There's on one level, looking at the way that HTS governed in Idlib province for years. There was hints of its Islamist teaching and roots and all of those things, but had not gone quite as far as we saw the Taliban, or quite frankly, even ISIS, when they had territorial control in Iraq and Syria, of enforcing some of the stricter measures. In the long run, that is a primary concern of mine, is, does HTS and Shara believe in what Shara is saying? That sounds remarkably, that sounds honestly really great to Western ears, of inclusion and diversity and all of those pieces. But I also am a little skeptical in the long run.
And yeah, and of course has far less control over Syria and is far less well embedded than the Taliban is in Afghanistan, because they've had decades of things. Just a quick one. You know, the leader of Syria at the moment and his al-Qaeda roots, and the whole of the US post 9/11 mantra was, we don't negotiate with terrorists. We're going to go into Iraq. We're going to go into Afghanistan. We're going to, you know, get rid of all this thing, and we're going to end up having him securing Syria for us, so that it doesn't become a hotbed of terrorism?
Yeah, I will.
What do your colleagues think of that when you when that's discussed around the Washington dinner parties?
I will say on the one hand, al-Shara has always been very dedicated to Syria and to removing Bashar al-Assad, and that was his focus even as he was the leader of al-Nusra Front and now HTS. But again, that's also the concern, and I think why, as Aaron mentioned, HTS still remains on the foreign terrorist designated list. Why? I have to go back and double check, but I do believe when a U.S. delegation went to Damascus, I think in December or early January, I believe that they lifted the designation on al-Shara himself. So as was discussed earlier, with sanctions, there's a little bit of this chicken and the egg of, I personally would like to believe that people can change, but also there's a lot of long history that that would lead me to be very concerned of what the long-term goals and desires are of al-Shara and HTS in the coming years.
Not to become a vibrant Western-style democracy like we were talking about 20 years ago with Iraq and
exactly
Libya and all the rest of it. There are some questions from the audience. We won't have time to get to them all, but I'm going to read them out, and then I'm going to go around the panel again to try to actually get a conclusion to our debate. Is what next for Syria and the region? Essentially, I think we've nailed the Syria bit, but let's talk about the region. But Ritesh and Igam, how badly has Russia been impacted by the fall of the Assad regime, and how might the future relationship between Moscow and the new Syrian regime play out? Philip Bowman, since the actors now holding power in Syria have already ruled in different parts of the country, e.g. Idlib, what are the chances of more inclusive politics going forward, which would be needed unless you go into that federal style of state we were talking about? And Prashant Kumar, how do the future of Hezbollah and Iran's local networks look after Assad? Let's put all those into the mix, and I'd like to go now to Munqeth Othman Agha. Given all those questions, what next for Syria and the region?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to emphasize something that also, as everybody said, the challenges are very high, and I think the challenge is equal or if more than the opportunities here. So that means we should be a little bit humble of our expectations, what that might happen at the end of the transitional period. Also, Syrians themselves in Syria are a bit humble. They are optimistic, but not very optimistic, and they understand the challenges. So I think we also should understand that. For me, I think that the second point I want to mention that outside Syria, probably the discourse about Syria mainly shaped by two things right now: the counterterrorism and the background of the current government and the issue of minority. And I think if we keep seeing Syria from these two lenses, that will be very counterproductive, especially for international actors when they deal with Syria as it's a different social group, antagonistic minorities against each other. I think this is a counterproductive as well for the country, and that won't help the government itself to be inclusive. If you want the government to be more inclusive.
Would it be better, given what Aaron said about the exceptionalism, would it be better if the West, particularly the US, stayed out of it as much as possible? And sort of yes or no answer to that. Should we big footprint or small footprint?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I mean, how much should the West and our values and the systems that we try to introduce in developing countries and post-conflict situations, how much should we stay out of it now? Be a little humble, as you said, and let the Syrians sort it out for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, we should listen to the Syrians themselves, what they want and how they deal with each other. I think The problem is when, for example, like the Israeli rule now in Syria, which is, I think, the most destructive rule in the country, when they explicitly saying we're gonna protect Druze and Kurds and we want them to separate from the country, and that's a very counterproductive. How I would expect social groups in the country, if they feel they are protected by external actors, to sit on the table and they feel they are equal to other counterparts in the country. So I think this is important to keep in mind, that we should give a chance for the Syrians and we should support them for what they want. And as also Karen mentioned before, this is a huge amount of disinformation now in the country, and we should be also very careful in terms of what we believe, what not believe. And it was sad last week to see even ministries in big countries repeating some very disinformations. And go ahead.
Let me come in there because we are running, unfortunately, out of time. I'd like to go to Federica D'Alessandra there. And really, my question again is, because you talked about these various institutions coming in on accountability and everything. Would it be better if the West and the US and that we stayed out a bit? Or not?
I mean, look, I think that part of what has fed in things going wrong in previous contexts has been this sort of attitude that, you know, whether it's the US, whether it's the West, or, you know, but normally funders, right, like from other countries come in and say, you know, this is our vision. This is how we think things should be done. And this has been a problem across international justice. It's, you know, been top down for a very long time. That's changing, right? We are seeing now a lot more centering of victims themselves and what they want to see, and these donors shifting the mindset and seeing themselves as sort of empowering actors in, you know, tell us what it is that you want, and here's how we can help you, right? I think that's the right approach. And as of right now, we really don't know what exactly that's going to look like for Syria. And I think it's too early to be prescriptive. What I think it's important is that although it's fair for, you know, say the European Union to say, you know, if you want my support and you want humanitarian assistance and you want, you know, financing for the reconstructions, there are some red lines that, you know, we are enshrined in our values and our legislations, and that, you know, as you as the recipient ought to be abiding to, right? Okay. I think that's fair. But it's different to say that and to say, okay, this is our vision for how accountability needs to happen, for how inclusivity needs to happen in Syria. Go, you know, here's the money, go and implement it. What is happening right now, I think it's the national reconciliation process or the national dialogue process is just starting, right? The first conference, February 25, right? Maybe not the greatest signs in terms of the outcomes. I think that the intentions maybe, or the signals around the intentions were the right ones. The outcomes left lots of groups, you know, still with many doubts around the prospects for inclusivity. But I think that it's too early to say. And that certainly there's still a lot of space for the conversation to be shaped, but it has to be driven by Syrians themselves, and they have to be all part of the national process in a way that it's frankly not, you know, as extensive at this particular time.
Karen, can I come to you to sum us up in about 10 seconds? What next for Syria and the region?
I would say that to look to the Syrians themselves, they have proven to be incredibly resilient as a population over the civil war, and I think they will tell us their vision for the future, and the international community should listen to that.
Thank you very much. So we should listen. We are out of time. I think we have nailed it in a way that what Karen just said is that we should listen. The Syrians are resilient, but it is going to take years or decades. It is not going to be an overnight solution. As Aaron said at the beginning, the US president has got his eye off that particular ball at the moment, so we can think about the risks or maybe the opportunity from that. But thank you, the audience, for your questions and comments. Thank you, the panel, Aaron David Miller, Munqeth Othman Agha, Karen Sudkamp, and Federica D'Alessandra for helping out on this question of what next for Syria and the region. I think we nailed some of it. For the next few months, we are now holding these Democracy Forum debates twice a month. In June and September, we plan to hold streamed and in-person Democracy Forum debates at a central London venue. The next stream debate is March the 31st at 2 p.m. London time, the growing Afghan refugee crisis in Pakistan and its impact on the Pakistan state. Until then, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all of us at the Democracy Forum, goodbye.